digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined once again by Steve Dan from Amplified Robots. We have with us Kate Edwards from the International Game Developers Association and James Dean back from the ESL. Welcome everybody.
Hello.
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 So, just to give our listeners a little reminder about who you are and what you do, I'm going to ask you to explain a little bit more about what you're up to. And I'm going to start with you, Steve, because you now have another feather in your cap, another little title to add to your many-stringed bow, which includes being the chairman of the VR/AR Association here in London. But would you like to explain to our listeners a little bit about all the multiple different things that you do?
Right, I'll try and remember them all in chronological order. Well, basically, I'm the founder and the CEO of Amplified Robot. Amplified Robot is a VR and AR studio / labs / incubator and agency. So we do all things to do with AR and VR. I'm also the co-founder of Medical Realities. And Medical Realities is using virtual reality to teach surgeons and doctors and medical students surgery. I also run with the help of Tanya, the Augmenting Reality Meetup group, which is all about AR and VR space. And yes, I've just started to become the president of the London chapter of the VR and AR Association. And I think that's actually going to be quite relevant to our day's conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. And Kate, why don't you explain to us a little bit more about the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA?
Sure. So the IGDA, we have been around for over 20 years, and we are essentially the professional society for anyone who makes video games worldwide. And so the organization has over 130 chapters around the world. We've got over 30 special interest groups in areas ranging from AR and VR to production to writing to different affinity groups like women in games, blacks in gaming, and so on. And we basically exist to advocate on behalf of individual developers on issues that affect them in the workplace, whether it is crunch time and work-life balance, whether it is diversity and inclusion in the industry, issues like the AR law in New York State or wherever it is worldwide. I mean, we basically watch out for them in a way very similar to what trade associations do for companies that they represent in the industry, whereas we are representing individual developers worldwide. So that is our focus.
Not a small thing to do by any means of the imagination.
No, it's quite a task.
Indeed. James, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you're up to with ESL UK?
So ESL UK is the subsidiary of the global largest eSports league. We're holding events all over the world. There's several a month now. Our subsidiaries across the Atlantic and also into Asia. We have about 15 studios now across the world. And we're basically taking gaming content and creating amazing tournaments and events out of it, online and offline.
Okay, so for the people who don't understand what ESL or eSports is all about, because there are a few people who don't necessarily know or have never been to something. Give us a little explanation in terms of what kind of sizes of audience you reach, but also what kind of scope of market there is in terms of things like the gambling that is kind of hinged on the back of what happens at a live eSports event.
That's a long answer, but but just to try and to sum it up. So basically eSports has come about. It's not a new thing, but it's really come about in the last few years because bandwidth speeds, etc., have allowed people to start consuming digital content being produced online over broadband connections. So although there's a big uplift in people actually creating what we call let's play content, which is basically YouTubers or influencers sitting at home who play through games. They have a webcam on, they talk about the game they're playing, and they create an audience around that and a fan base. But we're taking it to the extent where we actually create tournaments. So teams are building up around the world. They're now multi-million organizations in their own right. They have their teams fly across the world. They're playing. Each team will play a specific game, but there's about 18 different games which are regarded as an esport right now. They are attracting millions and millions of viewers. So a typical large esports event will attract around 50 million unique views during a couple of days, about 1 million concurrent viewers at any one point. So it's kind of starting to grab a bit of global attention now. It's become a bit of a buzzword within, I think, the finance industry and investments, etc. And so it's quite an exciting time for us, really. But then, of course, being a sport as such, being competitive and there being professional teams with a fan base in place, it attracts gambling. And that's something we can't stop. It's something, there's a lot of money to be made around that business. So gambling operators all across the world, including illegitimate ones as well, which is another subject for maybe another day, are putting odds against match wins and in-game betting, etc. So, of course, that raises the topic of things like match fixing and fraud and some other integrity issues, which we also have to address. So there's lots of work being done in that area, and we're quite far on, but it's a very fast-moving industry, I'd say.
I do believe eSports Integrity Coalition has just been launched. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's some really great, headed up by a chap called Ian Smith. It's been really successful so far. In fact, those guys were the ones to implement drug testing out fairly early on in some of our larger events, because it came about that some of these players were taking some performance enhancing drugs.
Okay, so that's a whole other podcast for another day. But today we're going to talk about something slightly different. And what I want to do is I want to revisit this article that Kate wrote or spoke on a little while ago now about this new law that was being passed or attempting to be passed in New York that would essentially place the burden of responsibility on the developer, Niantic, to identify where there were high-risk individuals or places that their game should not be encouraging people to essentially sit and wait outside because it puts players potentially at risk. Now, it was an interesting article because it was really putting the burden of responsibility on the individual developers to understand and know A, what the individual laws are, territory to territory, but also B, to be able to update and maintain that database and that information on an ongoing month-to-month basis, which is quite a lot of work for an individual developer. But it led me to an interesting conversation around the social and moral obligations for developers. And when we talk about these things, we tend to be very much in our bubble of the development community and the technology community that we exist within. But we often forget to ask the questions that just because we can do something with the technology doesn't mean that we should do something with the technology. And who is it that's asking this question and holding us accountable when the rest of the population aren't necessarily getting a chance to be involved in that conversation? So I want to start with you, Kate, just because you are the culprit of the source of this conversation today. In terms of your thoughts on this and the fact that there isn't necessarily enough people asking that question or holding people to account as we are kind of leaping into these new technologies and we're getting further and further down the line with new types of technology, be that electronic tattoos, be that contact lenses where we're talking about being able to insert the technology into the body and having smart pills and all these things that people are talking about. But who at what stage is asking the right questions and who should be asking those questions, I suppose, is the question. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, one of the things that a lot of people don't know about my background is I'm also a geographer and cartographer, and I've worked in the game industry for over 20 years doing what I call culturalization work. So my job has been to adapt content for international markets, not just localization, which is mainly language translation, but actually adapting the content in a way that's going to make it compatible with the local expectations around the world, because obviously we want the games to succeed in as many places as possible, and not all visions of different games are going to succeed everywhere, and nor necessarily should they. But that's my job, as companies have asked me to help adapt this content. And a lot of these questions around should we or could we, when it comes to content choices, have come up over the past 20-something years of me doing this work. So I'm very familiar with that thought space in terms of pondering how do games fit into a specific culture? What role do they play? Who's basically deciding what the narrative is going to be around the game, not the game's narrative, but what the game means to that culture. And most typically, in terms of it, and I think this is pretty much everyone would understand this, most typically the governments in most locations are the ones who set those guidelines because they ultimately control the means of distribution. They're the ones who can restrict content from entering their country, or I should say try and restrict content going into their country. You know, in some countries and more open markets, say like here in the United States, it's not the government that regulates, it's Walmart, Target, and other major retailers who say we are going to stop games that are this kind of rating or not. That's kind of what sets the benchmark for what gets distributed. But of course, you're always going to find other outlets for getting it. And so it's been interesting to see, you know, who sets kind of the line in the sand, so to speak. And one of the things I often speak to developers about is the notion that they need to be keenly aware of the choices that they're making in their content, the technology they're developing, and kind of step back at some point and just think about it. Think about what are the potential implications, not just the potential revenue they're going to get from this new technology or the new game or whatever it might be, but think about how it fits into the larger scheme of what we have now and what it could mean in terms of changing the game, so to speak, you know, in the long term. And I think it's a healthy exercise to take. I mean, for a lot of developers, it's just going to be not a difficult exercise, because if they're just making yet another game for yet another franchise, it's like, okay, yeah, so how is Call of Duty 6 going to differ from Call of Duty 5 in the marketplace? Well, probably not much. You know, but if you're making a game that pertains like you're something like Pokemon Go, that's going to use this incredibly popular IP and set people forth into the streets and the parks and everywhere searching for creatures, then yeah, that has larger implications.
So I'm curious, Steve, from your perspective, because obviously some of the work that you're doing with things like medical realities, as a for example, it's very groundbreaking. You're on the very front edge here in terms of changing the perception of how a surgeon learns their craft and what happens and what occurs in the operating theatre. I mean, you guys were responsible for the world's first live streamed 360 cancer operation being streamed to the world. And there has to be some implication there in terms of how you're setting a bar of expectation for how these things will work. Do you pause to ask those kind of questions in terms of what will follow beyond what we've done here, or how will people take this and use this as a standard bearer?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, because we're working in the medical arena, and we're working on both sides. We're working with patients and with doctors and surgeons and hospitals. So we have to be very, very careful that we actually get everything correct, and we get everybody understanding what's going to happen when we do one of our recordings, for instance. So that we've set in place a lot of guidelines that all our staff have to work towards. I think we're lucky in a way that we're starting off, because it started off in the UK, and the UK's got pretty strict guidelines about what you can do, and we have to adhere to those. So they're as strict as anywhere else in the world. So we're starting off from a point of view that is actually going to be able to roll out everywhere else. But I think that brings us on to the slightly different thing, because with AR and VR, we're not selling through Walmart, we're not selling through places, we're actually selling over the internet. And it's really difficult for people to control what actually goes up on the internet. And I think that's going to be the conundrum. So you could have a law placed in New York, but in actual fact, the game is created or streamed via somewhere else. How are they going to enforce that law? Do they just go back to the developer and say, hey, somebody else has bought the rights to stream this game or put it out there, but it's still your fault that something's happened? At the moment, I think that with Apple and Android, when we post apps up on those platforms, they've got pretty strong guidelines as to what you can and can't do. And to quite honestly, that they police quite a lot, and they stop a lot of things going out there. So I think Apple and Android are actually doing quite a lot of that that sort of work in that place. So stopping things that shouldn't be getting out there from getting out there in the first place. But it is going to become more and more difficult because basically if I create an online game, an online VR game or a mobile AR game that's downloadable anywhere, how are people going to police that?
Okay. So, James, I'm curious to hear from you in terms of just following on from what Steve was saying there about this notion that it does become a little bit difficult when you're dealing with this big bad thing called the internet, and there are, no real ways to identify necessarily who holds the burden of responsibility in certain situations and scenarios. And I'm sure that you have come across this kind of thing before where perhaps there is an issue around, gambling, or there's an issue around, piracy or performance or whatever that thing may be.
Age ratings as well.
Yeah,
we find, yeah.
These kind of things. I'm curious from your perspective how you see something like this kind of panning out further down the line, given that Steve's kind of right in as much as a lot of this content is kind of just going out there in the ether. And this is going to become a thing that somebody will come up with ways or means to be able to view this content without necessarily having to download an app, without necessarily having to do it via a mobile phone. What do you kind of see as being the future for that?
Well, it's quite interesting you ask, because we obviously had the problem with ages to begin with, because although we kind of go for the PEGI rating system, that's just really for playing games, right? What we're doing is creating content around those games, and some of these games are obviously, they can be violent and that sort of thing, but there's no real sort of legal stance for any of this sort of content being produced, and the same goes to say with some of the gaming content online on YouTube and Twitch, where there's even product placement, for example, and then we had this gambling issue where there's illegal markets where you can where operators are actually allowing anyone to gamble with in-game items. Problem being is that these in-game items could be actually swapped for a cash alternative, so which ultimately means it's gambling, and this really came out very recently. To continue on that, and obviously we see VR and AR becoming a big part of what we're doing over the next few years, especially whether it's playing the game or the content itself, is that being it's so much more immersive, it sort of just amplifies these problems. It becomes just 100 times more of a potential issue. And I think it's going to be interesting how it does get sort of policed in a way. And we're all open to ideas and organizations that are kind of trying to figure that out. But as a tournament operator ourselves and a content producer, we're very aware of those, and we have to make some decisions ourselves, because ultimately, our audience is young, and it's a malleable demographic that can be taken advantage of.
So I'm curious then, in terms of this audience that you kind of have a responsibility for to a certain extent, do you feel like there are certain types of behaviours that are emerging or being encouraged through these new types of technology, or these new ways of being able to experience things? And I say this on the basis of, if we look at where we were with mobile phones like a decade ago, nobody really thought that mobile phones were going to be quite the thing that they are today. We've all become slightly obsessed with our mobile phones. We all check them, certainly millennials check them about, 170 times a day. It's become this crutch that we need in our lives in order to continue being able to be productive and engage with other people. And certainly there are a lot of people who don't feel like they can communicate socially without having a mobile phone kind of in their pocket or in their hand to be able to refer back to things or use that as some kind of catch-all net in some ways. And I'm curious, do you think that there are certain types of behaviours that will emerge or that will be encouraged because of the introduction of virtual reality or augmented reality? And I'm going to fire that one at you, Steve.
Oh, I was hoping you weren't, Tanya. That's a very good question. And to be quite honest, I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. I think for sure that certain things are going to happen in the VR space and AR space which we don't even realise yet. I'm not entirely sure what they'll be. A lot of what happens is obviously sort of peer pressure and people liking things or disliking things, or people becoming relaxed about things happening. And that tends to sort of take place almost by a process of osmosis. It's very difficult to set it up. It just happens out of a cultural setup. But of course, talking of culture, that could be different for each country in the world, because what might be acceptable in the UK or America or France might not be acceptable in Morocco or China or India, for instance.
Okay, so Kate, do you have a take on this in terms of what you think might be the types of behaviours that you might expect to see as a result of people being exposed to VR or AR technology on a daily basis?
Well, I think there's a few issues. I mean, one of the things I wanted to mention, just to kind of backtrack slightly on this, and it does relate to this point, is that earlier this year I was contacted by a journal that basically is used by the U.S. Congress to form opinions on specific issues that are emerging, whether it's technology or social issues or environmental, whatever it might be. And they wanted my comment on the notion that there is a consideration in the Congress, just some, not a law or anything like that, but just some murmuring, so to speak, about the need to regulate VR. And I was already kind of taken aback at the very notion that someone is considering regulating VR. And so as I got into the discussion and I was asked questions, the basic premise that was being put forth is exactly this, and I quote, "Because games cause violence, therefore, immersive VR games will cause more violence." So they're already operating on a false premise, because we know that games don't cause violence. It's been shown many times in different studies. And so they're already assuming that VR is going to lead players and participants into a more violent behavior. That's the kind of the level of thinking that is going on, at least in this government.
It's interesting as well, though, because they've narrowed it right down to the singular of just gaming and what will happen to people who are using VR for gaming. But they don't seem to be looking at the broader expanse of what VR and AR can be utilized for, be that medical health, be that education, real estate, tourism, museums. There's so many different options here as to who might be utilizing VR, but to make that assumption that actually if something violent is being shown in the medium is going to make them more violent is kind of an interesting take on the whole medium.
And it shows a very skewed view. It shows a very uneducated view about what games are and who plays games and the outcome of games. And so it just illustrates that when we're talking about who's going to kind of set the moral tone and set the regulation on this kind of emerging technology, we all should be really concerned when that kind of thinking is fueling decision making like that. I mean, especially, and I think we saw that emerge with New York State's proposal to create this law about AR, which I think we understand, and I think most of us would accept the baseline rationale for why they're doing it: protect children from sex offenders. I don't think anyone's going to argue against that, but the notion that they want to create a regulation that affects an emerging market, affects an emerging industry to such a vast, gross degree, it's just ignorant. I mean, it's frustrating because there are so many other implications, and so player behavior, as we've seen by the internet alone. I mean, when we look back on things like what anonymity does to human behavior online, it's pretty drastic and pretty despicable in a lot of cases. And so what I do expect to see AR and VR, a certain level of translation of that known behavior, negative and positive, the ability to connect with people, the ability to communicate, to have experiences you can't have in the quote real world. There's all the good things that we've seen in game spaces, in social network spaces, and so on, I think are going to translate into VR and AR, but we're also going to see, I think, likewise, the enhancement of negative behaviors, because that's people exploit as much as they can. And unfortunately, what we're going to be seeing, as we already see, like with the New York State example, they are strictly looking at the negative example, and in that case, looking at the negative example of one particular slice of criminal in one particular slice of a game. It is so narrowly focused, and yet the outcome would affect so broadly. It's just incredibly short-sighted.
James, I'm curious to hear from you in terms of you obviously, as ESL, you're very much kind of a main supporter of the eSports Integrity Coalition. And so you're kind of at the beginning stages of this type of conversation right now in terms of what's going to be going on with the esports industry and the landscape as it currently lies. And I'm curious, are you hearing these types of assumptions and these types of broad sweeping conversations that people want to kind of apply something that is literally going to impact the entirety of the esports community, but they are focusing on quite narrow things?
Well, there's lots of sort of talks now within certain government. France specifically are really jumping on top of it, and I think they're going to be the first to start really making some impact that could actually be negative towards the industry as well as potentially positive. But they are consulting consulting us, and they're consulting others within the industry, which is a good thing. In the UK, we seem to be in a good place right now. It's DCMS are very much looking at this space and working out, how do we fit? And unfortunately, we also have our trade body, Yuki, who are doing some really great work in esports specifically. So they're actually working on a white paper right now, which will be submitted to government and various bodies across the world, in fact, to sort of educate all the issues and try and find those ones that are completely irrational, as Kate says. I think we definitely see that for sure, but it's very easy to make a brash conclusion from, as with the Pokemon example. I think it's just crazy. Whereas really, you could argue, well, if I put a big pot of gold in a really dodgy area of London, someone's going to go and get it. So it's balmy to sort of blame that on a game and say we need to start regulating the industry in that respect. But yeah, I think in a way, as long as there's this consultation and the government as such is actually communicating with the industry and trying to understand it, and the UK Gambling Commission as well on the betting side of things, they're being sensible about it, I would say, and to be fair to them, it's been a good process so far and a good experience for us. But I can't talk for the past. I think there was an issue that arose not long ago, actually, where a regulatory body were looking at mobile games within the UK, and they were trying to determine whether that was some sort of gambling or whether that entire kind of mobile games with some element of purchase within some game currency or items, etc., that should be regulated by even maybe the Gambling Commission. So it's very topical, and I think it stems from people just not understanding the real picture and what's really occurring within that space.
So, Steve, from your perspective, being that you are the chairman for the VR AR Association here in London, or rather the president of, do you feel that there is this kind of discussion happening at the moment in terms of VR and AR, or do you think this is one of those ones that it needs to be picked up, it needs to be nurtured a little bit more?
Well, I think that's very interesting. We're actually starting on that process, because I think it's definitely something that we need to discuss. And just sort of drifting back a little bit onto your last point, because I'm very aware of the power of certainly virtual reality and VR, because we know how powerful it can be in palliative use for various things within inside hospitals, and pain reduction and reduction, for instance. Now, I think it's quite possible to take that the other way and actually become very negative. And I could see you could really create a horrific horror story experience inside VR, which might literally scare someone to death. And I think that's the type of thing that developers have to be aware of, because VR definitely has a lot of power behind it. It's such an immersive and such a something that could actually completely take over the viewer. And I think we have to be very careful about that. And we have started talking with inside the VR and AR Association about sort of setting up guidelines to give to people, just as a guide. But I think that James sort of touched on it, that we've all got to be careful of sort of unscrupulous people sort of jumping in and trying circumventing what we're trying to do. But it's something that I think we have to take action on, because if we take action on, then we're going to divert an awful lot of problems before they actually start to happen.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to the kind of the core thrust of the question, which is with new technology and new types of ways of experiencing things, do we feel that burden of responsibility for the moral and ethical questioning of whether or not the product should exist should be one that is being asked by the developer? Or is there somebody externally who should be looking at this and saying, you know what, just because you're capable of this doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do? Should we be building these tools and these features necessarily just because there's the clever technology to do so? And one of the reasons I ask this is because we're at this stage now where the technology really is miles and miles ahead of where we are in terms of being able to come up with creative ideas to utilize the technology. And so it feels like we're almost at a stage where people are just throwing together experiences and throwing together content because they can, not because it necessarily makes any type of storytelling or narrative sense as such. And so we're scrabbling to keep up with that. We're scrabbling to find ways to tell stories in meaningful ways on these new platforms and in these new devices. But should that be something that we kind of take a pause and say, maybe we shouldn't be doing this? I'll throw this question at you, Kate.
Well, I think it's a joint responsibility, to be honest. I don't think it's something that can be put on one particular party. I mean, I think everyone involved in the process, because we have it's sort of a joint process. I mean, in game development, it's not just the game developers creating a game and putting it out there. It's also the consumer and the public responding to the game and basically giving them feedback whether or not this is something that they want to play. It's no different from any other creative media, whether it's film or books or anything else. It's like you can write any kind of book you want, whether it's offensive or whatever. You can make any kind of film. It just, is there a market for it? And that may or may not always be the question, whether or not there's a market for it. But typically, a lot of the creative media is driven by what kind of revenue it's going to actually make. And so, a lot of people experiment with a lot of different technologies. You can look just in the app world alone, people toying with all kinds of apps that do all kinds of funky, weird things and some very practical things, and I think some of these will stick and some of them won't. And so I think there's an argument to be made that basically you have to let the market decide. But that being said, I do think developers really should, as I previously mentioned, I think they do have partial responsibility to take a look at what they're making and decide whether or not, and do some basic research to decide whether or not this is going to be something that is going to be viable, not just for them, but actually for the target market and for the demographics that they're actually looking at. Is this something that's going to help? Is it something that is going to be too disruptive? It's hard because most content or indoor technology developers develop a certain myopia about their own work, because obviously they're not doing it on a philosophical basis usually, other than, I think I'm going to change the world. And so this is the greatest idea that mankind has ever seen. And, a lot of them kind of move on from that premise. This will be the greatest game ever. This will be the best book ever. And so there's a certain myopia around their own work that kind of makes it difficult for them to see the implications of their work. And that's where I do think it's sort of a give and take. I really do not want to see some kind of regulatory body make that decision, because regulatory bodies tend to be biased in their own way. Now, it depends on the purpose of the regulatory body. If it's for the protection of consumers, like physically, like there's a device that someone's coming out with that could, like, let's say a new jetpack or something. Yeah, I probably want some kind of regulatory body looking at that for safety purposes. But I don't want the government basically telling me what kind of game is, quote, good or bad. That's exactly why game ratings were created years ago. It was basically to stave off the government stepping in and rating the game. Whereas, at least in the U.S. case, it was the ESRB was created by the industry, by the trade association ESA, in order to make sure the government isn't the one making those decisions. And so it's a bit, in a way, it's a bit self-regulating. So there's it creates a third-party entity within the industry, represents the industry, but is separate enough to kind of help guide and make sure that some of the stuff being produced may or may not be appropriate. So I think it's not an easy answer, but I think there's multiple parties involved.
Okay. So I am curious to hear from you, James, in terms of your thoughts and ideas on what you think it is going to be that's really going to make a significant shift, that's going to change the way that ESL engages with immersive entertainment or immersive technologies, and how you see this kind of shift change occurring, whether that's a cultural shift or a technological shift. What is that big thing that's really going to change this and make it part of your everyday day-to-day business?
I mean, what we're seeing is that, actively seeing, is that our audience is kind of living out the game in many different ways. I mean, one thing we do is around the world is we tend to do a lot of events and work at Comic Cons, and it kind of fits well together because people are really living that experience in real life. They're dressing up as game characters, they're meeting up with like-minded people, and they're celebrating the games they're playing. There's a very common interest, and eSports is just one element of that. So and then there's sort of a reverse engineering model as well, where we're starting to find those sort of people would find typically at a Comic Con is now coming to an ESL eSports event, because it sort of fits together in that respect. So I think as time goes on and we start getting into a much more immersive experience, I think everything will it'll be amazing experiences. You get to really experience things that you wouldn't normally have ever experienced, and that can go in any direction. And I mean, especially even experiencing the events we put on from a remote location, etc., and having viewpoints you wouldn't have ever had before. But I think leading on to how that sort of really does get controlled, I expect we would take guidance from the likes of a PEGI, an organization that will make a very determined decision of whether or not that content is which demographic that content is appropriate to. And I think that's the way we would have to work it. But it's so difficult to say. I mean, we're in a situation right now where we're just trying to discover and work on how does this new emerging technology fit in with our audience, which arguably is a very early, a bunch of early adopters. So we know it fits well. It's just how and what's the result of that going to be. I mean, we actually had a couple of our guys at Gamescom, a couple of our casters. They were playing some of the new games by CCP, and we were trying to work out, is this the next esport? This sort of physical action game in a virtual world where it could be absolutely anything. And that's just scraping the surface, I guess.
Okay.
So the direction it goes, it's impossible to say, but I expect we'll look at, who decides what is appropriate and to who.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Steve, what do you think that big significant shift is going to be for you?
Significant shift. I think that with the VR and AR Association, I think we definitely want to get guidelines in place to sort of help us and help every developer along the way, because I think with those guidelines, that helps. I think that you've also got to sort of delineate between the people that use games and how they're made. Unfortunately, I've read just this morning about a Japanese truck driver who's just killed somebody because he was playing Pokemon Go while he was driving his truck down the road. Now, I don't think Niantic ever imagined that somebody would be stupid enough to do something like that. But, you're never going to be able to legislate for all the things like this, because I also actually rather worryingly saw that somebody's created a virtual reality game that uses live ammunition.
What?
Yes.
Doesn't sound terribly safe to me.
It doesn't sound very safe to me, and it's not, I suppose, not strictly virtual reality, but it's definitely using that type of thing. And they are definitely using live ammunition. So I never underestimate the ability of people to come up with some weird and wacky ideas that actually are always going to sort of stretch boundaries in all possible ways. And I think that usually sanity does prevail. and I totally agree with Kate that I think the one thing that we don't want is we don't want legislation in these matters, because legislation sometimes, no matter how well intentioned when it starts off, can actually end up being something which brings into play something which they didn't think was going to happen, and can be quite detrimental sometimes. So I'm all for
self-regulation, absolutely,
and guidelines, and going along that route. So and I think that most people want to create great, compelling games and ideas and things to see and things to interact with, both in virtual reality and augmented reality. And I think that that they should be allowed to do that really almost unfettered, without getting into something which is going to put somebody into harm's way, for instance.
Okay. And Kate, what's your take on this?
Well, I think, it's going to be interesting to see how this goes. I mean, kind of one of the points that I made previously in that discussion around the whole New York State thing is my concern is that we, as producers of digital content and digital technology, I mean, we're facing a huge gulf between the reality of like existing legal regimes, that they are so antiquated and outdated. Here we've got a state in the U.S. talking about regulating an emerging technology that's barely even off the ground, when we don't even have laws that protect people against online harassment in an adequate way. And that's a far, far bigger problem than Pokemon Go at the moment. And, so I think one of the things that I really think we need to do, and I'm not exactly sure how this gets started. I've tried it in my own little microcosm with different governments I've spoken to, and different groups that I speak with as I travel around, is that I think there needs to be a broader, high-level conversation about how virtual space interacts with real space and what that means, both from a legal standpoint, a social standpoint. It has so many dimensions to it. It's not just about the AR part. It's certainly about, what about virtual currencies? What about virtual items? What about online harassment? What about AR and VR? I mean, there's so many different issues and layers to it. But I think we need to figure out as a society at the highest level, what does that mean? How are we going to allow that interaction to exist? What kind of rules do we need for that interaction? Because right now, it just, there's an excitement to it because it's new, and it's just this continuing involvement of the digital world that all of us live in for the most part, except for those who are, in emerging markets or markets that don't have the technological or economic advantage yet. And so it's a much bigger conversation I think we have to have. And it's just, I'm not sure if we're even prepared for that conversation, because it's a kind of a scary one, to be honest.
It is, but at the same time, I think it's one of those things that the sooner we begin the process, the better it will be for everybody involved. And I do think it's a little bit more about self-regulation and self-identification of the need to discuss these things than it is necessarily waiting for somebody to come in guns blazing and saying, this is the way that it should be, and we want to, legislate around this. So yes, very interesting. But guys, I want to thank you all for joining me on this Digital Jam session. And as normal, we would like to ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to. And I would like to start with you, Steve.
Right, that's great. Thanks, Tanya. It's been a great conversation. Yes, I can be found these days on a new handle, Twitter handle. It's @VR to AR, and that's capital V, capital R, number 2, capital A, capital R.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Kate, where might we find you?
You can find me on Twitter. I am IGDA_ED. That's my handle. I don't tweet to excess, but I'm on there, and it's a good place to kind of keep up with what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Thank you. And James, what about your good self?
You can also find me on Twitter @J1MCO, Jimco. It's my old gaming handle.
You always feel the need to explain that to us.
Yeah, I know. It's a bit weird, really. But,
it's good. It's good. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review. And follow us on Twitter @DigitalJamLTD. DigitalJamSessions.com